Good evening, my friend, and welcome. Before we wander into another quiet corner of the past, allow yourself a moment to become wonderfully unimportant. Let the concerns of today drift gently to the edge of your thoughts, where they can wait patiently until morning, much like a sensible farmer waiting for spring instead of attempting to persuade frozen ground to produce cabbages through sheer optimism. Find a comfortable position, soften your shoulders, unclench your jaw, and take one slow breath, then another. The world has managed perfectly well without your constant supervision for several thousand years, and with any luck, it will continue doing so while you simply listen. Tonight, we are traveling back more than 7 centuries to a Europe that smelled rather more of wood smoke than perfume, where sunsets determined bedtime more reliably than clocks, and where falling in love was rarely as straightforward as poets insisted. Medieval poetry often suggested that love floated through castle windows, accompanied by moonlight and beautiful music. Medieval parents, meanwhile, generally preferred that love arrive carrying a respectable dowry, 3 healthy oxen, and written approval from everyone remotely involved. If you had been born in a small village during the 13th century, would you have been allowed to choose the person you loved? The answer, like so many things in history, is both yes and no, which historians have elevated into an art form. Imagine opening your eyes before sunrise inside a timber cottage, whose walls have listened to generations of whispered conversations, crying infants, family prayers, harmless gossip, and occasional arguments over whether someone had forgotten to latch the chicken coop. The house is modest, built from heavy oak beams filled with woven branches coated in pale clay. The floor beneath you is packed earth, swept clean each evening with bundles of dry twigs until it becomes smooth beneath bare feet. Above your head stretches a ceiling blackened by decades of smoke. Nobody intended it to become that color. It simply happened one winter evening after another, as fires warmed families through endless, cold seasons. The beams resemble the branches of an ancient forest turned upside down, each carrying the memory of countless evenings spent beneath flickering flames. The first thing you notice is not silence. It is breathing, steady, gentle. Layer upon layer of sleeping family members surround you beneath thick wool blankets. Your younger brother has somehow migrated sideways during the night, with the astonishing determination found only in children and house cats. Your grandmother sleeps lightly near the hearth because warm bones appreciate warm stones. An elderly uncle occupies the narrow space beside the wall, snoring with such dependable rhythm that one suspects he has entered into a private agreement with eternity itself. Privacy, in the modern sense, has not yet become fashionable. Warmth matters far more. Sleeping separately would seem almost as peculiar as deciding to heat every room of a modern house with a different fireplace, simply because everyone desired personal space. Medieval people possessed many admirable qualities. Excessive privacy was generally not among them. The blankets resting above the family are heavy with years of careful repair. Tiny patches overlap older patches until the fabric resembles a map, whose borders have been redrawn so often that no one remembers where the original lines once lay. They smell faintly of sheep's wool, smoke, lavender stored during summer, and the curious sweetness that old cloth develops after protecting generations from winter. Outside, dawn approaches patiently. Pale ribbon of silver appears beyond the shuttered window. Frost clings to wooden fences. Tiny droplets gather along every blade of grass, each reflecting the first hesitant light of morning, as though the earth itself has scattered thousands of tiny mirrors across the fields. The village wakes gradually. No shrill alarm breaks the peace. Instead, a rooster announces the new day with the unwavering confidence of someone who firmly believes the sun would refuse to rise without his personal encouragement. Other roosters immediately join him, proving that confidence, while admirable, is often highly contagious. Nearby, cows shift their weight inside timber byres. A horse stamps softly against packed earth. Somewhere, A goose begins another morning of being deeply offended by circumstances that remain entirely unclear. Inside the cottage, yesterday's fire still hides beneath a blanket of ash. One careful hand brushes away the gray covering. Tiny crimson embers glow beneath, patient and faithful. The fire has been sleeping, not extinguished, simply resting. Dry twigs are placed gently above the hidden warmth. A slow breath encourages a faint orange spark. Another breath follows. Soon a thin curl of smoke rises into the cool morning air, before delicate flames begin licking the smallest branches. There is something strangely comforting about this ritual, repeated almost every day for countless generations. It feels less like starting a fire than waking an old friend who already knows exactly what is expected. The smell of oak smoke slowly fills the room. Modern visitors might wrinkle their noses after several hours. The villagers scarcely notice. To them, smoke smells like breakfast, warmth, security, and survival. The cooking pot is lowered above the flames. Inside, oats begin their patient transformation into porridge. There are few meals in history less glamorous and more dependable. Porridge never conquered kingdoms. It never inspired epic poems. Yet it quietly fueled millions of ordinary lives while ambitious nobles busied themselves arguing over borders that would eventually change anyway. Dark rye bread sits beside the hearth, baked several days earlier. Its crust has become firm enough to challenge weaker teeth, but a few moments beside warm broth soften it into something deeply satisfying. Cheese made from goat's milk waits beneath a linen cloth. If the previous summer had been generous, there may even be a small pot of honey, treasured carefully because bees possess an inconvenient tendency to produce sweetness according to their own schedule rather than human desire. Children eat quickly, not because anyone rushes them, because work begins early. A boy of perhaps 10 accompanies his father toward the fields. His linen shirt feels cool against his skin until a wool tunic settles over his shoulders, bringing immediate warmth along with a gentle itch that medieval people accepted with remarkable philosophical calm. Wool scratched. That was simply part of life. Complaining about it would have accomplished roughly as much as complaining that rain was somewhat damp. His leather shoes bear the village changed almost without anyone noticing. One season, the children who had been chasing geese across muddy lanes were suddenly expected to stand beside adults in the fields, carrying tools that seemed almost as tall as they were. Medieval childhood was not separated from adulthood by birthdays wrapped in ribbons or elaborate ceremonies. Instead, it faded away like morning mist. One week you were asked to gather eggs, the next, someone quietly handed you responsibilities that stayed with you for the rest of your life. For boys, this often meant longer hours behind a plow or beside a blacksmith's fire. For girls, it meant spinning wool until fingertips became familiar with the endless dance of coarse fibers, kneading bread before sunrise, carrying water that always seemed heavier on the journey home than on the way to the well. Nobody announced, "Congratulations, you are now an adult." The aching muscles usually delivered the news first, and somehow, amid all those ordinary routines, affection found tiny places to hide. Not because medieval villages encouraged romance. Quite the opposite. Privacy was perhaps the rarest luxury anyone possessed. Entire families shared a single room where every cough, whisper, dream, and snore belonged to everyone else. Falling in love under such circumstances required remarkable creativity. Imagine attempting to exchange meaningful glances while your grandmother loudly criticized someone's turnips only a few feet away. History rarely celebrates these invisible victories. Village festivals became treasured interruptions in the rhythm of work. Several times each year, fields rested, saints were honored, markets expanded, and ordinary people allowed themselves the remarkable extravagance of leisure. Color appeared almost magically. Clothing that usually remained folded inside wooden chests emerged into daylight. A dull brown tunic suddenly gained a carefully embroidered collar. A faded blue dress acquired ribbons saved for months. Leather shoes received generous applications of grease until they reflected the sun with surprising determination. The village itself seemed to inhale. Merchants arrived with carts filled with unfamiliar spices, polished knives, ribbons from distant towns, tiny mirrors, fragrant herbs, and occasionally objects nobody truly needed but everyone admired anyway. The smell of roasting meat drifted slowly through the air. Ale flowed more generously than common sense. Children darted between market stalls like energetic sparrows, while older villagers pretended not to watch them, despite smiling every few moments. Young people finally discovered something even more valuable than the merchandise: each other. The festival created one of the few socially acceptable opportunities for boys and girls from neighboring villages to meet without immediately attracting suspicion. Families remained nearby, certainly, but the crowd itself provided a peculiar form of privacy. Two strangers could stand beside the same storyteller. They could laugh at the same joke. They could admire the same music. Then came the dancing. Modern couples often dance by facing one another with practiced elegance. Medieval village dancing looked considerably less concerned with elegance and considerably more concerned with avoiding collisions. Long lines formed, hands briefly touched. Partners changed. Circles expanded and contracted. Someone inevitably missed a step. Someone else laughed. Someone's hat flew away. A dog occasionally joined the procession with complete confidence that this was all being organized specifically for its entertainment. Oddly enough, these wonderfully imperfect dances accomplished exactly what they needed to accomplish. Hands met, eyes met. Smiles lingered slightly longer than necessary. Entire romances sometimes began with nothing more dramatic than accidentally stepping on someone's foot and apologizing sincerely. One suspects historians should perhaps devote more attention to awkward dancing. It has influenced civilization far more than many kings. Markets served a similar purpose. Young women selling cheese might spend several hours arranging wheels upon wooden tables, pretending enormous concentration while quietly observing who walked past. Young men delivering sacks of grain somehow discovered endless reasons to circle through the marketplace. Oh, I forgot something. Again, and again, and rather mysteriously. Once more, their memories became astonishingly unreliable whenever attractive neighbors appeared. Parents noticed these patterns immediately. Parents always have. Some approved. Others became wonderfully skilled at interrupting conversations exactly when they began becoming interesting. Nothing changes across centuries quite as much as we imagine. The church encouraged proper behavior, naturally, though proper often depended upon who happened to be observing. Public displays of affection remained limited. Courtship, when it existed, usually unfolded through conversations during work, shared walks after church, or brief exchanges while carrying baskets from one place to another. Love rarely arrived dramatically. It accumulated, rain filling a quiet pond. Perhaps a young man consistently offered to help repair a widow's fence because her daughter happened to live there. Perhaps a girl saved the freshest loaf from her family's oven for a particular shepherd returning from distant pastures. Perhaps neither admitted anything aloud for months. The village, however, usually knew long before they did. Villages possess astonishing investigative abilities. Every glance became evidence. Every conversation generated theories. Every delayed goodbye produced entirely unnecessary levels of speculation. It was, in many ways, an early form of social media, except the algorithm consisted mostly of elderly women, spinning wool while remembering absolutely everything. Letters of love certainly existed, although literacy limited their usefulness. Many ordinary villages could not read or write fluently. When affection needed words, people often borrowed help from priests, scribes, or unusually educated relatives. Imagine asking someone to write, with complete dignity, "Please tell Margaret that I cannot stop thinking about her smile." The scribe, naturally, knew Margaret. The priest probably knew Margaret. Half the village knew Margaret. Privacy remained remarkably theoretical. Still, written words carried extraordinary power. A folded piece of parchment represented effort. Ink cost money. Writing required skill. Receiving such a letter meant someone had invested resources more valuable than convenience. For those unable to write, songs became letters carried by memory instead of paper. Traveling troubadours wandered across parts of medieval Europe singing about impossible devotion, distant ladies, noble sacrifice, and hearts enduring impossible separation. Love, it turned out, belonged to two very different worlds at once. In one world it lived quietly inside shy smiles, shared walks, borrowed songs, and the comforting knowledge that someone else happened to glance in your direction whenever the church doors opened. In the other world, love found itself surrounded by contracts, negotiations, property, family honor, and an astonishing number of adults who believed they understood your future better than you possibly could. These two worlds occasionally cooperated. Quite often, they politely ignored one another. For peasant families, marriage certainly involved affection whenever fortune allowed it, but survival always occupied the seat closest to the fire. The household needed enough hands to tend crops, repair fences, gather firewood, milk animals, mend clothing, and eventually care for aging parents. Choosing a husband or wife therefore resembled choosing a lifelong business partner, farm manager, child care expert, carpenter, baker, veterinarian, and emotional companion, all at once. Modern dating applications ask about favorite hobbies. A medieval village was considerably more interested in whether someone could successfully keep chickens alive through February. It was, admittedly, a practical concern. Parents watched their children grow with quiet calculations, unfolding behind every conversation. They noticed which neighboring farms prospered, despite poor harvests. They remembered which families owned an extra field, a healthy ox, or a reliable water source. These observations accumulated over years, patiently assembling invisible maps of possible futures. Young people imagined weddings. Parents often imagined winter food supplies. Neither perspective was entirely unreasonable. Among noble families, these calculations expanded dramatically. Marriage became a language spoken between powerful houses rather than simply between two individuals. Castles, estates, political alliances, military support, trading rights, and future inheritances could all depend upon a single wedding ceremony. The bride and groom occasionally seemed almost surprised to discover they were attending their own negotiations. Imagine being informed that your future spouse had been selected because two distant counties might stop arguing over taxes. Romance was asked to wait politely outside until the paperwork had finished. Dowries played an important role in these arrangements. A bride's family often contributed money, livestock, land, textiles, household goods, or valuable objects that would support the new household. This was not simply a payment, although modern descriptions sometimes reduce it to one. Rather, it represented a family's promise that their daughter would begin married life with security. A carefully woven blanket could become part of a dowry, so could a sturdy chest, copper cooking pots, a few sheep. Perhaps even a treasured silver cup passed quietly from one generation to the next. Each object carried invisible fingerprints from countless family members. Every spoon had stirred familiar soups. Every blanket had warmed familiar winters. Marriage therefore involved carrying pieces of one's childhood into an entirely new home. The groom's family contributed expectations of their own. They promised shelter, protection, opportunities for work, and a place within an already existing rhythm of daily life. In many villages, a newly married couple did not immediately establish an independent household. Instead, they joined the husband's extended family beneath the same roof. Privacy, never abundant before marriage, became almost mythical afterward. Imagine beginning married life while sleeping only a few feet away from parents, grandparents, younger siblings, curious cousins, and perhaps one goat who had somehow wandered indoors because the weather appeared inconvenient. One quickly learned that whispered conversations required genuine skill. The wedding itself offered a welcome pause from ordinary labor. Church bells echoed across fields that had witnessed generations of similar celebrations. Villagers arrived wearing their finest clothing, which usually meant garments carefully protected from everyday work throughout the year. Fresh herbs decorated doorways. Flowers, when available, brightened simple wooden tables. Candles flickered softly against stone walls darkened by centuries of smoke. The ceremony itself remained surprisingly brief compared with the celebration that followed. Vows mattered deeply because they were spoken publicly before family, neighbors, and God. Promises carried tremendous weight in communities where nearly everyone knew one another. Breaking such promises did not disappear quietly into anonymity. Only villages remembered. Villages, as we have already discovered, possessed extraordinary memories. Afterward came the feast. Now, medieval feasts have occasionally been imagined as endless mountains of roasted meat, accompanied by heroic quantities of wine. Reality depended greatly upon wealth. Noble weddings certainly displayed impressive abundance, but village celebrations reflected simpler circumstances. Fresh bread emerged warm from communal ovens. Cheese appeared in generous portions. Stews simmered patiently over open fires. Ale flowed with increasing enthusiasm as the afternoon faded toward evening. Honey cakes might appear if someone had enjoyed an unusually successful season with beehives. Music returned. Dancing resumed. Children chased one another beneath long wooden tables while adults pretended not to notice. Someone laughed too loudly. Someone cried quietly There was something quietly persistent about forbidden love in the medieval world. It did not usually arrive with dramatic speeches beneath moonlit balconies or reckless midnight escapes through castle gardens. Those stories certainly existed, and poets adored them because poets have always been wonderfully optimistic about how much free time ordinary people possessed. In reality, forbidden love was usually much quieter. It appeared during ordinary mornings while drawing water from the village well, during slow afternoons at market stalls, or after Sunday Mass when two people happened to leave the church at almost exactly the same moment for reasons that neither could adequately explain. It often began with nothing more extraordinary than familiarity. The baker's apprentice saw the miller's daughter every market day. A shepherd greeted the blacksmith's niece each morning as the sheep wandered toward the hills. A young noblewoman noticed that one of her father's educated clerks possessed an unexpectedly kind smile. Human hearts, rather inconveniently, have never been especially interested in social hierarchy. Society, however, remained extremely interested. A marriage between families of different status could create more anxiety than a failed harvest. Wealth, land, inheritance, reputation, and carefully constructed alliances rested upon predictable marriages. Love, unfortunately, possessed a deeply inconvenient habit of ignoring carefully constructed plans. Parents frequently reminded their children that affection could grow after marriage. Sometimes this proved true. Sometimes it required remarkable patience. Sometimes it remained an optimistic theory that everyone politely repeated because questioning it would have made family dinners unnecessarily uncomfortable. Among noble households, daughters especially carried the hopes of entire family dynasties. Their marriages could strengthen alliances that had taken generations to build. Their choices were rarely viewed as entirely personal. Even a smile exchanged too freely during a banquet could become the subject of quiet conversations among watchful relatives. Castles, despite their impressive walls, contained surprisingly little privacy. Servants noticed everything. Ladies-in-waiting noticed even more. Messengers, stable boys, cooks, scribes, and guards all became unwilling historians of daily life. Secrets moved through great halls almost as efficiently as smoke from the kitchen hearth. One wonders whether the stone walls themselves eventually grew tired of listening. Yet affection still found hidden paths. A folded ribbon left upon a windowsill, a flower placed inside the pages of a prayer book, a melody quietly played on a lute during an evening gathering, carrying a meaning understood by only two people in the room. No grand declarations, no theatrical performances, only gentle signals exchanged beneath the watchful eyes of an entire household. For peasants, forbidden love usually looked different. Social class still mattered, but practical concerns often spoke louder than noble bloodlines. A widow with children might hesitate to marry again, because another household desperately needed her labor. A young man without land could struggle to persuade a family that he possessed enough stability to support their daughter. Love, unfortunately, could not plow fields, nor could it repair leaking roofs, although it probably wished it could. Money, livestock, and available farmland influenced countless decisions. A marriage might be delayed for years until enough resources had been gathered. During those waiting years, two people often lived within sight of one another, working separate fields beneath the same sky, exchanging brief conversations whenever daily routines happened to cross. Patience became another language of love. Some couples waited quietly, others did not. The church taught that marriage formed a sacred bond, and faith shaped nearly every stage of life. Priests encouraged fidelity, stability, and devotion, believing that marriage reflected not merely an agreement between two people, but a promise witnessed before God. For many believers, this understanding brought comfort. Marriage offered certainty in a world where disease, famine, and hardship could arrive without warning. To belong to one another through both abundance and scarcity created a kind of shelter that extended beyond wooden walls. Yet human nature remained delightfully resistant to perfect order. Adultery certainly existed, although medieval records often preserve it through court proceedings rather than romantic poems. Most secret relationships never became famous. They unfolded quietly, hidden beneath ordinary routines until discovered through gossip. Coincidence? Or astonishingly poor planning? History repeatedly demonstrates that keeping secrets inside small villages is approximately as effective as attempting to hide church bells beneath a blanket. Eventually, someone noticed. Someone always noticed. Punishments vary according to local customs, social rank, and the authority of regional courts. Public apologies, financial penalties, acts of religious penance, or damage to family reputation could all follow the discovery of forbidden relationships. Reputation itself functioned almost like another form of currency. It took years to build, only moments to weaken. Families therefore guarded their honor with remarkable determination, not solely because of pride, but because reputation influenced future marriages, business partnerships, friendships, and trust within the wider community. A single scandal rarely belonged to only one individual. Entire families carried its weight together. Perhaps the most quietly fascinating stories involved members of the clergy who discovered that vows of devotion did not magically silence ordinary human emotions. Medieval Europe expected priests in many regions to remain celibate, dedicating themselves entirely to spiritual life. Reality occasionally proved more complicated. Historical records contain scattered reminders that priests were, after all, still human beings navigating the same emotional landscape as everyone else. Some formed relationships that contradicted official expectations. Others struggled privately with feelings they believed should never have appeared. The contrast between ideal and reality was not unique to the Middle Ages. It remains surprisingly familiar today. This gentle irony appears throughout history, again and again. Every generation builds beautiful rules describing how people ought to behave. Every generation then discovers that people continue behaving like, well, People, sometimes wise, sometimes foolish, usually somewhere comfortably in between. Secret meetings required remarkable creativity. Lovers arranged conversations while collecting firewood, attending festivals, visiting distant relatives, or walking toward shared water sources. Every ordinary errand contained the possibility of becoming something quietly extraordinary. A path through the forest became more than a shortcut. A bridge across a stream became more than timber and stone. An evening market became more than a place to purchase vegetables. Location slowly gathered memories invisible to everyone except those who had created them. Years later, someone might cross the same bridge without realizing another pair of footsteps had once paused there, speaking softly about hopes that history would never record. Most of these stories disappeared completely, not because they lacked importance, because ordinary happiness and ordinary heartbreak rarely found chroniclers. Kings received biographies. Generals received monuments. Young villagers exchanging nervous smiles beside a flour mill received only memory. Perhaps that is why their stories feel strangely close to us. The details differ, the emotions do not. A hesitant conversation, an uncertain conversation, the quiet hope that another person feels exactly the same. 7 centuries have passed, yet those small moments remain remarkably unchanged. And eventually, every romance, whether joyful, arranged, forbidden, or patiently earned, would encounter an authority even greater than parents, neighbors, or local lords. For above every village, every castle, and every family stood the church, whose bells marked the hours of daily life, and whose teachings reached from humble cottages to royal palaces. It would define who could marry, who could not, when love became sacred, and when it was judged a sin. As the centuries unfolded, the church became more than simply a place where people gathered each Sunday. Its stone walls stood at the very center of medieval life, quietly measuring time itself. The bells welcomed children into the world through baptism, witnessed promises between husbands and wives, marked the passing of each season, and eventually rang softly for those whose earthly journey had come to an end. For many medieval people, it was difficult to imagine any part of life existing entirely outside its gentle but persistent presence. Marriage, therefore, was never viewed as merely a private agreement between two people. It belonged to the entire community, and, ultimately, it belonged to God. By the high Middle Ages, the Church increasingly described marriage as a sacred sacrament, something carrying spiritual meaning beyond practical arrangements or family alliances. Love itself remained deeply personal, but marriage became a covenant that reached beyond human convenience. This idea changed the rhythm of countless lives. A wedding was no longer simply the conclusion of negotiations between families. It became a promise believed to echo into eternity. That promise demanded preparation. Couples were expected to understand the responsibilities they were accepting. Priests questioned whether both individuals truly consented to the marriage. Although family influence remained powerful, church teaching gradually emphasized that mutual consent mattered. In theory, no one should be forced into marriage against their will. Reality, as history often reminds us with a patient smile, occasionally wandered away from theory. Pressure still existed. Families still persuaded. Economic necessity still whispered practical arguments into many conversations. Yet the church quietly introduced an important idea, that a marriage required the willing agreement of both bride and groom. For its time, this was remarkably significant. Another concern occupied medieval permanence. Unlike many modern societies where divorce has become legally possible, medieval Christian marriage was generally understood to last for life. This did not mean every marriage was happy. Far from it. Some couples shared deep affection. Others developed quiet companionship over many years. Still others simply learned to coexist with remarkable patience. Human personalities have never been perfectly compatible simply because a ceremony declared them so. Yet the expectation remained. Promises were intended to endure changing seasons, financial hardship, illness, disappointment, aging, and all the ordinary surprises that life gently scattered across the years. The Church recognized separations in certain difficult circumstances, particularly where safety or serious conflict required distance, but separation did not usually grant permission to marry someone else. Marriage itself remained intact. This created lives filled with quiet endurance rather than dramatic conclusions. Modern audiences sometimes find this difficult to imagine. We often expect every story to reach a satisfying resolution. Medieval life was less concerned with satisfying endings than faithful perseverance. Sometimes history is not a novel. Sometimes it is simply people continuing to wake before sunrise because the cows still require milking regardless of emotional complexity. There is something oddly comforting about that. Life insists upon continuing. Harvests cannot be postponed indefinitely while someone reflects upon complicated feelings. Bread still needs baking. Children still need feeding. The seasons remain wonderfully indifferent to human drama. When forbidden relationships became public knowledge, communities often responded with public acts of repentance rather than private conversations. Confession played an important role. Individuals sought forgiveness, not only because they feared punishment, but because faith genuinely shaped how many understood themselves. To modern ears, this may seem distant. Yet for medieval believers, the spiritual world felt as immediate as the weather. A troubled conscience carried real weight. Public penance sometimes required standing before fellow villagers, acknowledging mistakes with quiet humility. One can imagine how uncomfortable such moments must have been. There are few experiences more memorable than apologizing before people who already knew exactly what had happened. Villages, after all, remained astonishingly efficient information networks. Honor also occupied an enormous place within medieval society. A family's reputation extended across generations like carefully woven cloth. Every thread strengthened the whole, yet a single tear could become painfully visible. Parents therefore protected not only their own good name, but also the future opportunities of their children and grandchildren. This concern occasionally produced decisions that appear harsh today. Yet within their own world, they often believed they were preserving stability for those who would come afterward. History asks us not necessarily to agree, but to understand. Understanding is quieter than judgment, and often more useful. Not every marriage, however, remained untouched by grief. Disease visited medieval Europe with unsettling regularity. Accidents occurred. Childbirth carried significant dangers. Wars occasionally swept across peaceful regions. Many husbands and wives experienced widowhood far earlier than anyone would have wished. The death of a spouse transformed daily life in ways both practical and deeply emotional. An empty chair beside the fire, one pair of footsteps instead of two. Silence where familiar conversation had once filled ordinary evenings. Grief entered not only grand castles, but also the smallest cottages. Widows and widowers faced difficult choices. Some remained alone, preserving the memory of their husband or wife while focusing upon children and household responsibilities. Others eventually remarried. This was not necessarily viewed as disloyalty. Quite often it reflected practical necessity. A farm required workers. Children needed caregivers. Life, persistent as ever, continued asking ordinary questions despite extraordinary sorrow. The Church generally accepted remarriage after the death of a spouse, recognizing that companionship, stability, and mutual support remained valuable gifts. Even here, hope quietly survived alongside loss. Perhaps this is one of the gentlest truths history offers us. Love does not erase grief. Grief does not erase love. The two often learn to live together with remarkable grace. As medieval people looked toward heaven, many believed earthly separation was not necessarily the final chapter. Faith offered the possibility that husbands and wives, parents and children, friends and families might one day meet again, beyond the struggles of this world. Whether one shares that belief or not, it undoubtedly brought comfort to countless people whose lives contained more uncertainty than certainty. And as generations passed, villages changed, kingdoms rose and disappeared, castles crumbled into ivy-covered ruins, and the bells continued marking the passing centuries. One quiet realization slowly emerged. The customs surrounding love had transformed dramatically over 700 years, yet the heart itself had changed very little. Now, as our gentle journey through the Middle Ages slowly draws to its close, it is worth pausing for a quiet moment to notice just how much has changed and how much has remained wonderfully familiar. Today, many people can choose their own partners without asking permission from a lord, a bishop, or an entire village council. Courtship may begin with a message sent across a glowing screen instead of a smile exchanged beside a village well. Love letters have become text messages. Troubadours have become playlists. Village fairs have become cafes, parks, universities, and countless unexpected places where two strangers happen to meet. The details have changed beyond recognition. The feelings have not. A racing heart still beats a little faster before an important conversation. Someone still wonders whether another person feels the same. Families still offer advice, whether requested or not. They have been performing this service with unwavering confidence for thousands of years, and there is little historical evidence suggesting they intend to stop anytime soon. Parents still worry, friends still speculate, grandparents still believe they know the secret to a happy marriage. Humanity, it seems, remains comfortingly consistent. We sometimes imagine medieval people as if they belong to an entirely different species, separated from us by stone castles, iron armor, and candlelight. Yet beneath the wool cloaks, rough leather boots, and smoke-darkened ceilings lived people whose emotional lives would feel surprisingly recognizable. A young woman hoped someone would notice her. A young man rehearsed conversations in his mind that never sounded quite as graceful once spoken aloud. Newly married couples wondered whether they would build a happy home together. Parents stayed awake at night, worrying about their children's future. Widows quietly remembered voices they could no longer hear. These emotions crossed every century without asking history for permission. The castles eventually became ruins. The kingdoms changed their borders. The great noble families faded into dusty genealogies. Even the proudest names, once spoken with enormous ceremony inside glittering halls, gradually became little more than ink resting peacefully inside old books. Time possesses remarkable patience. It never rushes. It simply continues, and perhaps that is the quiet lesson hidden beneath the story of medieval love. People spent enormous amounts of energy protecting wealth, titles, family honor, and political alliances. Some succeeded brilliantly for a generation or two. Others failed spectacularly. Entire dynasties rose believing their names would echo forever, only to discover that ivy grows quite happily over forgotten castles. Meanwhile, somewhere beyond those grand halls, two ordinary villagers shared warm bread. After a long day's work, watched their children grow beside the same small cottage, grew old together, and disappeared from history without leaving behind statues, portraits, or magnificent chronicles.